Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me along to have the opportunity to introduce tonight's event. And I also want to welcome everybody to the Visual Culture program that looks to our department field reports, or what we're calling field reports. It's really amazing to see so many people on the for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Wood Roberto. I'm the current head of the Visual Cultures Department. And by way of a contextual introduction, I thought I'd start off by saying a bit about the ethos of visual cultures, its perspective or its outlook on the world, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. We might say, if not to operate as a rigid discipline or specialism that's closed off from others, our aim is more to do with linking that which insists on taking form in the world, often from unexpected but very urgent places, in order to ask what's possible through what could be thought of as maybe porous experimentation, or as Donna Haraway might call it, sympoiesis, or making with others in exciting or dynamic models. So with this in mind, and to contextualize the environmental humanities research cluster in the department, we might recall that in October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported only 12 years to avoid disastrous global warming. Later, in April 2019, Extinction Rebellion emerged as a visual force and began to stage nonviolent city block protests. Then in June 2019, the Green New Deal petition for Goldsmiths was signed and circulated. And in July 2019, students in the world declared a climate emergency and rose up in anticipation for what will be next year's Council of Parties, or COP26 in Glasgow. This year, of course, we experienced and witnessed monumental shifts within the sphere. The global pandemic has arguably changed everyday life more so than any other event outside of wartime, recalibrating the way that we relate, communicate, and cohabitate the world with one another. And in many ways, COVID-19 has raised public awareness of the abuse of the natural world and its many scalar effects that can be felt today. So we might ask, what's to be done, or more accurately, what can we do? And surely any response to climate collapse necessitate huge cultural shifts alongside political and economic change, and significantly across diverse academic disciplines. In contrast to propositions about the Anthropocene that are neutral or triumphalist and suggest a singular narrative of progress towards what is called eco-modernization, several departments at Goldsmiths have proposed to investigate unfolding environmental crises through critical perspectives that denaturalize the history of colonialism and industrialization, through which we have arrived at the present, attending to the structures of power, economies, and worldviews that enable environmental violence, and to past, present, and emergent ways of life and resistance that suggest alternative and livable futures. So this brings me to the Critical Ecology's research stream, and I'll put the website for that in the chat after I'm finished with introducing our speakers. This stream is part of Goldsmiths Technologies, Worlds, and Politics Research, a group supported and funded by Goldsmiths Research and Enterprise Committee. And since its inauguration in 2017, the stream has tackled questions of global warming, environmental justice, colonial dispossession, climate migration, studies, cultivation practices, nuclear, air pollution, media geology, and e-waste, all from an interdisciplinary arts and humanities perspective that frequently involves artists, curators, designers, and theorists, working in collaboration frequently with scientific researchers and institutions. Notable examples of engagement with scientific practitioners by stream members include the art department, Dr. Ellie Carpenter, whose nuclear culture research group and curatorial practice was supported by Arts Catalyst, a Center for Science and Technology, and then, of course, our own research architectures, Dr. Susan Schuppli, who's writing an artistic practice as we'll see this evening, examines toxic ecologies and environmental systems as informational networks. Within the stream, we also explore questions such as who and what suffers or benefits from ecological crisis, and through what structures do they do so? What research methods are adequate to respond to the multiple environmental crises that are unfolding? How can researchers represent, narrate, and intervene in multiscalar and multitemporal phenomena, plan for and confront present-day uncertainties, and to imagine and cultivate alternative spaces for living? The critical of the stream's title indicates an emphasis on the socio-political aspects of environmental harm. So, for instance, climate colonialism, environmental racism, and racial capital, as well as the urgency of developing innovative methods for responding to ecological crises at the present moment. Critical interventions entail moving beyond green solutions, such as market environmentalism and greenwashing, to a rethinking of both geopolitical institutions and the epistemological framework of proposed reform. We believe that contemporary post-humanities demand energetic and experimental encounters and exchanges from the disciplines that may historically have been separated. And as I've hinted, critical ecologies has formalized connections between existing areas of research, together established environment-focused initiatives from across many departments. So art, media, communication, cultural studies, visual cultures, which also includes the Center for Research Architecture, anthropology, computing, design, and English and comparative literature. The research stream brings to ecological issues the discerning expertise that Goldsmiths nurtures in terms of innovation, practice-led interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, collaboration with external partners, and the understanding of specific issues. So again, some of these are environmental racism, climate justice, toxic ecologies, indigenous sovereignty and nature, and critical approaches such as ecofeminism, Black studies, queer ecologies, post-coloniality or decoloniality, political ecology, science and ecology studies, and multi-species or animal and plant studies. Building on the growing understanding of the significant role and capacities for intervention that practice-led disciplinary arts and humanities research has in contributing to planetary health, the cross-department stream, as well as the environmental humanities and ecologies research cluster in the Department of Visual Culture, support both practice-led and theoretical studies of methods involving experimental inquiries across diverse sites, bringing together methodologies from contemporary art, expert and citizen science, agriculture, computing, design, and many other fields. In this way, we aim to expand understandings of ecology beyond the nature-culture binary, certainly that of the binary of nature and culture within humanist modernism, and contribute to creating a new vocabulary grounded in the recognition that all human activity is co-produced with nature and interdependent with what's been referred to as the web of life. So as I said, this new vocabulary includes a multiplicity of forms, for instance, artistic and media practice, which brings us to this evening's focus on my wonderful colleague, Dr. Susan Schuppli, that really goes a long way towards questioning what we assume about nature and age. I think most will find that the world moves beyond implicit binaries and assumptions, and it's very exciting to celebrate the launch of her book with her tonight. So I'll put there and hand it over to the co-lead of the Critical Ecology research stream and convener of Media Communication and Cultural Studies, MA in Post-Colonial Culture and Global Policy, Dr. Shella Sheikh, whose current research interrogates forms of witnessing between the human, technological, and environmental, all the while taking on a very rigorous decolonial perspective. So thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Wood. You were actually breaking up a bit for me, so I hope it's not my internet. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you? Yeah? Yes.
Your
Okay,
sound
cool.
better than Wood was, yeah, definitely breaking up quite a bit.
Okay, I was a little bit worried that my internet's going to cut out. Thank you, Wood and Yorela, for the invitation to chair this and be in discussion with Susan. Just to remind everyone coming in, because there's still people coming in, bleeping in the lobby, if you can mute yourselves and keep your cameras off, that will help the smoothness of what proceeds. And then we can always, in the sort of audience Q&A at the end, I'll be fielding questions. And you can put questions in the chat, and I'll do what I can after I've had a discussion with Susan to try and sort of go through those questions and collate them. And then if you wish to put your hand up, you can put your camera on and actually speak, which would be nice to see some people. I think that's all for housekeeping. So yeah, it's a real delight to be in conversation or to be introducing my very valued colleague, interlocutor and friend, Susan Schuppli. And I'll just give a little very brief bio. So Susan's a UK-based artist and researcher whose work examines material evidence from war and conflict to environmental disasters and climate change. So she's the author, as you will have guessed from this event, of the book Material Witness, Media, Forensics and Evidence, which was published this year by MIT Press. And she's going to be presenting this book. So I think a lot of you, I see a lot of familiar faces in the lineup of participants. A lot of you will have seen Susan presenting certain works, but this evening is really about the book. The focus is on that. So she's published extremely widely and exhibited internationally. And just to note that in 2016, she received the ICP Infinity Award for Research and Critical Writing. And she's currently reader and director of the Center for Research Architecture in the Department of Visual Cultures, and also a very active member, a crucial member, as Wood already mentioned, of the Goldsmiths Critical Ecology's research stream. So sort of beyond the official bio, as I already mentioned, she's a very sort of important interlocutor for myself. And I just wanted to sort of signal the importance of this event because the book came out in 2020, earlier this year, but there hasn't actually been an official launch. So it would have been much nicer if we were all in a room, all sort of 200 or so of us, almost, yeah. Together with some drinks in hand, but I just want to sort of note that this is a very sort of important event for celebrating Susan's book. There are some of us in the audience who've known Susan since doing her PhD in the Center for Cultural Studies. So the book sort of, it's amazing 15 plus years on to see this product, I have it here, but anyway, this come to materialize. So it's just something to celebrate. And yes, I think I'll leave it at that. Susan's going to present for about 50 minutes, and then we will have a quick break, and then myself and Susan will be in conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So do, as I mentioned, put your questions in the chat as you're listening, and we'll do what we can to get through them all. Over to you, Susan.
Great. Thank you, Shella, and good evening to everybody. First, just to say thanks to Yorela in particular for organizing these reports from the field. So it's really kind of wonderful to have the occasion tonight to bring this work into sort of a public forum for discussion, but to also have it situated within the context of the work of the department as a whole. So I think it offers hopefully some insight into the kind of wide range of kind of projects that are happening within the Department of Visual Cultures. Thanks to Wood for introducing the critical ecology stream. And as Shella has already said, and I would like to echo, many of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting tonight are, you know, the consequence of a wide range of extended conversations and activities. And Shella has been a kind of crucial participant in so many of those, actively involved in my various art production documentaries that I've produced, but also conversations that we share around different notions of kind of witnessing. Shella's much more situated within the decolonial frame and looking at the sort of more than human witness, whereas my frame is more perhaps within the remit of media and critical legal studies. So my plan for this evening is twofold. I've pulled out excerpts from the book that I am actually going to read, and that will help me stay focused, but I think it's important that the words on the page actually are presented tonight, rather than a kind of like informal discussion about the book. We will dip into a series of cases very briefly, because the first thing I would like to say, although this talk is situated within a sort of within the introduction that Wood made, which is in relationship to the ecological, the book itself is not a series of case studies where environmental issues are necessarily driving the different inquiries. So I'm going to present the book as it exists, and I have selected a number of chapters in which there are certain kinds of entanglements with ecological matter or ecological kind of conditions, just in the hope that I can sort of forge that connection. I'm going to share a screen, and at certain moments I will come out of that again. So let's see how that goes. And thanks to everybody. First of all, looks like we're going to have a fantastic set of potential questions with so many people in attendance. Shella, just a quick question. Is my audio coming across clearly?
Yeah, absolutely clear. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. So let me launch the screen sharing, and I am assuming that you can now see this full screen.
No, sorry, Susan, we can't. If you do what you did the second time around.
Okay, let's try that again. Okay. Now you're seeing my desktop. Is this full screen?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. I'm beginning with this image because obviously it's the cover of the book, but more interesting for me, people who have encountered the book, and that includes colleagues and former students, have sent me images of sightings of the book Material Witness. And like any practitioner, the most important thing is having your work land into the hands of others and become the part of conversations and the conversations and practices that others are engaged with. So I really wanted to begin with this image of the book out in the world. I'm going to take you through aspects of the book, and so I think it's important to note that the project Material Witness as a book project is organized as a legal trial. So the spine of the book is a series of legal events, if you will, beginning with opening statements, discovery, the hostile witness, hearsay, motion to strike, damages, toxic tort, and let's see if this is working. In principle, the page should, yes, wonderful. It continues with a chapter called Cross-Examination, Expert Witness, Burden of Proof, Failure to Appear, My Closing Arguments, and then finally it ends with Convictions. So the book is, as I said, is organized around a legal trial, and all of those legal terms are the entry points into a series of case studies. And the book actually opens with a small vignette, and I'd like to read some excerpts from that opening vignette now. A ghostly image of a corridor haunts a CCTV monitor that is no longer powered on. Its phosphor compounds permanently damaged by a relentless and searing view into the notorious Longkesh prison of Northern Ireland. The screen of this now derelict Panasonic surveillance system carries a materialized trace of electronic signals once relayed from a security camera mounted at a fixed vantage point within H Block 2 of the prison complex. Devoid of the movement of inmates and guards, the slow burn of the prison's architectural features into the crystalline structure of the screen reveals a carceral space that no longer exists, since various areas of the prison compound were demolished in 2006. What evidential role could a fogged piece of glass play in a peace process as visible proof of the powerful events that took place at HM Prison Maze throughout the many years it was in use? The representational demand to corroborate the contested versions of its history is significant, especially when experiences of prison staff and prisoners differ so dramatically. Yet evidence of what has transpired in the passageways of H Block is only partially captured by the residual traces of this particular screen. While the technical behavior of the cathode ray tube has in effect recorded a fixed and durational image of the prison infrastructure, the absence of any kinetic information obfuscates the presence of guards and inmates. Despite this evidential deficit, there is a stubborn resoluteness in the burnt-in image of this now dead video monitor that testifies to the simple fact that eyes and machines once conjoined to look into this very space and scrutinize its activities for years on end. Even with the closure of the prison in 2000 and the dismantling of its surveillance system, the material life of the screen still retains an electronic memory of the coercive space of state power to which its infrastructural gaze was once directed. While this technical witness cannot be called forth to testify to the specific acts that might have taken place in this H Block corridor, its evidential reach, a material composite derived out of years of prison activity, reaffirms that such a place once existed, that dreadful things might have happened right here in this hallway and behind its closed doors, which are not fully available in the defunct screen's phosphorescent afterglow. Evidence for events is never simply self-evident and must always be painstakingly created through processes, investigative, discursive, and rhetorical, that enable the mediation of things and allow even mute entities to make convincing truth claims. The materialized inscription of this transmissional regime thus functions both as a reminder that there are those who still have knowledge of this very space and as a mnemonic device for enabling their recollection. Analyzed together, they might yield information that could corroborate and further explicate the spectral testimony registered by this media object. Moreover, the very fact that such a screen image endures, despite no animating electrical charge, is a forceful expression of the power of materials to record and recall events. In this regard, the screen burn is both a material trace of and a material witness to the history of political violence known as the Troubles. This book introduces a new operative concept, material witness, an exploration of the evidential role of matter in registering external events, as well as exposing the practices and procedures that enable such matter to bear witness. Material witnesses are non-human entities and machinic ecologies that archive their complex interactions with the world, producing ontological transformations and informatic dispositions that can be forensically decoded and reassembled back into a history. Material witnesses operate as double agents, harboring direct evidence of events, as well as providing the circumstantial evidence of the interlocutory methods and epistemic frameworks whereby such matter comes to be consequential. Material witnesses material witness is, in effect, a Mobius-like concept that continually twists between divulging evidence of the event and exposing the event of evidence. In pursuing this research, I examine a wide range of materials that have recorded trace evidence of the violence that generated their contexts and explore the institutional and disciplinary protocols that enable their latent histories to be rendered intelligible and made to speak, even if their speech acts often fall upon deaf ears or challenge accepted truths. My case studies draw on many events in which different forms of technical media have combined to record a violation or transgression. Moreover, in initiating an account of the material witness with a media artifact produced by an automated form of machinic vision from a highly conflictual site and context, I wish to signal the conjunction between matter and evidence that shapes this enterprise as a particular kind of political project, one that discloses different orders of knowledge and the regimes of perceptibility that enable materials to become evidential and bear witness. Indeed, what the following cases highlight is the degree to which a rearrangement of matter exposes the contingency of witnessing, soliciting questions about what can be known in relationship to that which is seen or sensed, about who or what is able to bestow meaning onto things, and about whose stories will be heeded or dismissed. Consequently, the project also reflects upon the specific requirements that must be met to secure legitimate acts of witnessing, from legal tribunals to climate change summits, as they adjudicate over whether certain kinds of observational practices and testimonial methods should be enlisted or rejected. And I use the word legitimate in quotation marks. So it is within these institutional forums that witnessing itself can be witnessed. For it is here that it achieves its most prominent articulation as a distinct realm of procedural expression, subject to agreed upon conventions that turn on questions of expertise and direct experience. However, inasmuch as material witness seeks to trouble settled understandings of the concepts that organize its case studies, it also engages directly with the institutional logics that structure their difference in order to expand acts of witnessing to more than human realms. Throughout, I've tried to account for the myriad ways in which the responsiveness of matter to external forces demands an acute and renewed sense of material specificity in order to grasp the full political implications that such ongoing changes or interactions might yield. As a conceptual imperative and practical project, my aim is ultimately to relink the material world and its affordances with the space of the aesthetic, the juridical, and the political. Consequently, my analysis often cross-cuts between highly imagistic accounts and detailed technical descriptions. This is my mode of aesthetic assembly and narrative construction, which I borrow from my ongoing practice and sensibility as an artist researcher. Now I'd like to continue by reading another few excerpts that are sort of key elements of the ways in which I'm trying to develop this process. So,
Susan, sorry to interrupt. We can see your screen, so you can just see me. We can see you seeing me.
So I should stop screen sharing?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
Okay, does that work now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and I will go back into the keynote when I wrap up, yeah. To continue. From the capture of radioactive contamination by celluloid film stock, the multiple translations of binary code into a satellite image, to the trapping of ever greater concentrations of black carbon deposits within Arctic snow, when entities, including computational objects, are subject to external processes that bring about their structural reordering, they produce an informed material in the sense that their internal composition becomes progressively enriched by information. These are the moments when things are modified through direct contact, supplemented by extraneous information, or transformed through their handling and processing. Proceeding from the conception of the informatic as both proper to analog and digital entities enables aspects of this broader project, material as witness, to engage with computationally derived evidence, even when acts of recoding take place within the realm of abstraction, far beyond the thresholds of human perception. Rendering the material witness within the microarchitectures of metadata requires that we work back forensically through all the nodes and points of data capture, compression, and conversion, including the computational objects, transmissional relays with other networks and categories of assembly. This is why the notion of informational enrichment is so helpful, because it presupposes a new conception of materiality derived out of calculation and transcoding, a provocation for thinking materiality differently, for thinking the digital analogically. Throughout the book, I also refer to the productive labor of the forensic turn as an act of imagination rather than that which merely enables deductive reasoning, the sole purpose of which is to shore up the legal use value of things. Forensics, reconceptualized as such, is less a means of interrogation than a mode of assembly, not a claim for the irreducibility of the object, but an ecological proposition that brings media, science, and law into new political configurations. Forensics does not get us closer to the simple truth of things, but brings us into contact with the complex realities that constitute our contemporary experiences. Rather than a search for unequivocal certainties, the work of forensics herein is oriented towards opening up of the expressive potential of things, including the creative retrieval and mobilization of affects. As Donna Haraway has observed, quote, redistributing the narrative field by telling another version of a crucial myth is a major process in crafting new meanings. One version never replaces another, but the whole field is rearranged in interrelation among all the versions in tension with each other, end quote. So a culturally inflected notion of forensics also considers how non-scientific materials, such as artworks, literature, local knowledge, oral traditions, too might enact their relevance to events by furnishing alternate forms of information, what we might call proxy data, or even counter-testimonials to established understandings of events. In forensic science, every contact is perceived as leaving a trace. In forensic imagination, every encounter is capable of being retraced. And a few words about the material witness within a legal context. So in a legal context, the material witness is a person who is deemed to have information germane to the subject matter of a lawsuit or criminal prosecution that is significant enough to affect the outcome of the trial. In other words, the witness, by means of the information they may possess, is considered sufficiently pertinent to the legal proceedings such that every effort must be made to procure their testimony. Humans become witnesses when their knowledge or experience positions them as semantically material to a case. My particular usage, in contrast, takes the concept quite literally, material as witness. Jacques Derrida located the act of testimony philosophically conceived within the speech acts of the human subject, whose recall and public narration enable them to speak back to the events of history, or within the interpretative interpretive apparatus of disciplinary knowledge, whereby the expert holds court over the mediation and interpretation of things as evidence. Testimony, he argued, is of a different order than evidence because it is contracted to speech via a sworn oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. As he says, in quotes, consequently, where there is evidence, there is not testimony. The technical archive, in principle, should never replace testimony, end quote. This legal and philosophic distinction, which is in fact an administrative one, between the material witness as someone who can bear witness to an event and the technical witness as that which can offer material evidence of events but cannot testify of its own accord, is a site of continuous struggle throughout this book. While natural scientists tend to privilege brute matters of fact as the only true origin of reality, social sciences have made language the sole condition of intelligibility. And I'm just quickly going to jump back into my keynote. And Shella, can everyone see full screen and a quote?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. Karen Berard raises this fundamental paradox when she asks, how did language come to be more trustworthy than matter? Why are language and culture granted their own agency and historicity, while matter is figured as passive and immutable, or at best inherits a potential for change derivatively from language and culture? How does one even go about inquiring after the material conditions that have led us to such a brute reversal of naturalist beliefs, when materiality itself is always already figured within a linguistic domain as its condition of possibility? Invoking the speech acts of things is not to, Invoking the speech acts of things is not to propose a recoding of materiality as a quasi-linguistic form that would bring it closer to the social sciences, nor is it a rhetorical displacement of materiality into a set of signifying relations that would compose matter into intelligible patterns. It is rather a demand made on behalf of materials that we apprehend the potential of matter to reorganize accepted points of view and customary truths. Okay. Apologies for I'm jumping back and forth. I'm going to repeat that. It is rather a demand made on behalf of materials that we apprehend the potential of matter to reorganize accepted points of view and customary truths. Where there is material evidence, there is the possibility of testimony without it necessarily being contracted to the conventions of legal speech, nor indeed to that of human language. This involves a conceptual realignment away from a functional understanding of speech towards an engagement with the expressive technicity of matter. To borrow the legal concept of the material witness and then rework it through a cultural model of non-human agency is to consider evidence not solely with regard to what it claims it might help to establish or support, but also in terms of what it can do to bear critical witness to acts and techniques of witnessing. The trial always revolves around the questioning of different forms of testimony. Thus, what emerges out of such interrogative proceedings is, as Isabella Stengers posits, a testimonial artifact that can tell us a great deal more about the device of interrogation than the matters subject to its inquiry. One of my ongoing tasks as an artist researcher has been to highlight the many ways in which legal materials can also be worked on theoretically and practically within the spheres of culture. An interest in aesthetics or legal processes should not remain exclusive to the study of art, nor indeed the jurisdiction of law. We need rather to be attuned to the many ways in which different knowledges and their practices are already mutually effective. Clearly, the material witness of law cannot neatly be mapped onto a materialist conception of witnessing configured around the expressive agency of matter. However, as philosopher Brian Masumi suggests, a certain residue always carries over from one domain into another. As he says, when you uproot a concept from its network of systematic connections with other concepts, you still have its connectability. Migrating and repurposing concepts to inhabit other domains of experimentation is one of the goals of this book, and another means by which law might enter into a productive relay with the humanities to develop alternate conceptual frameworks and open up new critical perspectives. Now, what I'd like to do, without any reading, is to quickly dip into a series of chapters in the book. I'll just say a few words about each of them, and the pages of the chapter will just sort of naturally flip by. And I've pulled out the cases where there is an environmental sort of entanglement. And after that, I will just conclude, and then we can open things up to Shella's reflections, comments, and insights, and then more broadly, after a short break, to other questions. So let me get back into my keynote one time again. Okay, so you're seeing full screen again, I imagine. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so this case is called Discovery, and the case deals with the discovery of radioactive contaminants at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, several days, in fact, after the meltdown of reactor unit 4 at Chernobyl in the Ukraine. The reason that this is important, because the evidence for the events at Chernobyl evidence for that event didn't in fact make it into any kind of public consciousness at the site of the accident, at the site of the crime. It actually emerges out of the situation in Sweden where power plant workers working at Forsmark were heading into work Monday morning and started setting off the radiation detector. And so this was very kind of baffling to the workers in the plant, because they didn't understand where this leak was coming from, because the leak, in fact, somehow was happening exterior to the plant. To make a long kind of story short, after a series of tests and activities carried out that day, they discovered that the radioactive isotope that they had found was not, in fact, one that was produced by any of the nuclear power plants in Scandinavia. And they started to look at other power plants in the vicinity, and eventually had to turn their inquiry into the former Soviet Union. And what struck the analysts in Sweden, they actually pinpointed it to a Russian nuclear reactor that was much closer than Chernobyl. And when it was finally, after a period of 19 days, in which there was a lot of denial, of course, on the part of the former Soviet state that anything had actually happened in the Soviet Union. After a period of 19 days, the event of Chernobyl finally is sort of officially kind of corroborated. And so that whole chapter explores many attributes of this sort of specific case, including all of the different contestations around the evidence and the kind of claims that started to be made, and the many different technical systems that were enlisted to sense and detect these airborne radioactive contaminants. As we are well aware now, the scale of the disaster was kind of cataclysmic, and the hundreds of kilometers that these radioactive isotopes traveled over from the Ukraine over over Belarus to see their kind of fallout in Sweden. The level of radioactive contamination in Sweden pointed to the scale of the disaster, of course, at Chernobyl. So this first chapter is called Discovery. Another chapter that deals with the environment is a very short chapter called Toxic Tort. And Toxic Tort basically looks at two forms of, it looks at the emergence of the Russell Tribunal, which was in effect, a people's tribunal that was held in 1966 to 1967, in which they attempted to establish that the United States was guilty of war crimes in Vietnam. So one of these, we could call that almost like a kind of paralegal kind of institution that emerged. Another case that emerged out of the use of pesticides and herbicides in Vietnam, and the image that we see at the beginning of the chapter is a child who's called forward to this International War Crimes Tribunal, popularly known as the Russell Tribunal, and the child is testifying about napalm bombing and the effects on his body, et cetera, et cetera. What happens in the United States is a major class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of U.S. veterans, and it comes to be called the Agent Orange trial. And it's an interesting trial because the judge decided to make a moral decision and found in favor of the plaintiffs. What this chapter really tries to delve into is the fact that environmental justice is extremely hampered by the burden of direct causality that is the hallmark of criminal litigation. So in order to prove someone, not a state, because a state cannot be subject, at least within Anglo-American law, is not subject to a criminal filing. But the burden of direct causality has hampered so much of environmental justice work because there's a demand to prove that A caused B, and you have to connect those dots in a very linear manner. So cause and effect must be directly connected to prove criminal responsibility, to find someone culpable under criminal law. And so a lot of environmental justice claims have had to go through the avenue of what's called toxic tort law. And that's what this chapter then sort of looks at the limitations of any sort of accountability measures for environmental justice within existing legal frameworks, and looks at what other kinds of forums have been utilized to try and respond to environmental violations, infractions, and injustices, including as I said, the emergence of the People's Tribunal. And toxic tort law, for those of you who are interested, is a body of law that is often used in environmental cases because it's a body of litigation that mets out compensatory damages. So an oil and gas company will pay a fine, but they won't necessarily be found criminally liable. So that's what that chapter deals with. Another very different chapter called Expert Witness takes us back into the ICTY, and this was an interesting case because it involved a dubious video alibi in which Dukmanovic, who was charged with war crimes in Vukovar, Croatia, entered. After he was charged with war crimes, he furnished the court with a video alibi that had a date and time stamp signature on it. And the video, he submitted this video in his defense, arguing that he couldn't possibly have been at the farm at the site of the massacre because the video showed that he was somewhere else. And the video was a video that he actually shot out of the window of his car, or excuse me, rather vehicle. And it's quite blurry, but it's also strangely shows mostly the tops of trees as the person is driving down a highway. So you see these various kind of images of trees on the side of the road. What's interesting about this trial, first of course, it raised all kinds of kind of questions, but the prosecutors enlisted a investigator to go and retrace the route and to also film the same route. Now, of course, this is many years later when the case finally goes into court. Many years later, from the time that the massacre took place in Croatia and that the video alibi was produced. But what's interesting about this particular case was there was a dendrologist became the main expert witness, and he's an English professor, Professor Paul Tabish here based in the UK, and he was able to prove unequivocally that the branching structures of trees in the video alibi actually indicated that Dokmanovic, approximately halfway through his journey, had turned around and had driven backwards, back to the site of the farm. And so using images of the trees along the highway, a decade later, he was able to prove that there was that 3 specific trees, I think a mulberry, a poplar, and an oak, became these kind of crucial witnesses in the case because of their unique branching structures, which Professor Tabish went into a lot of detail around the fact that trees are actually more unique than, say, human fingerprints, etc. And if one can learn to read the branching structures of trees, you have a more resolute witness than a human being, in fact. So that's what that particular case explored. This I'll say just a few words about, because it really doesn't deal so much with the environment, but it's a case of an anonymous execution video that emerged after in the final weeks of the civil war in Sri Lanka in January, probably January 2009. It's a video that was smuggled out of Sri Lanka and made its way to the UK. But the video is really important because it shows extrajudicial killings, but in fact, there's been no accountability measures at all for any of the crimes that took place in Sri Lanka, because there has, in fact, been no regime change. And when I went to Sri Lanka, which was a couple of years after the end of the Civil War, the Commonwealth Summit had just ended. So, Sri Lanka is part of the Commonwealth, and so it was almost as if the Civil War hadn't happened, and the kind of the trauma of the war then became very individualized and carried as personal memories and kind of personal trauma. But
Susan, sorry to interrupt. You're not sharing your screen anymore, just in case you had intended to.
Oh, I had actually. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. It's gone. We just see you.
Did you see it for most of it?
Yeah, and just until just now.
Okay.
That's it. Yep.
Okay. So I'm almost finished anyway. So what I wanted to say, just this chapter, Burden of Proof, it does begin with the tsunami that ravaged the coast of Sri Lanka. And the reason I began with the tsunami, because the tsunami then becomes an actor actually in the entire unfolding of the conflict. It certainly humanitarian responses to the tsunami then were also a way that the state used to sort of reallocate aid to mostly to Sinhalese areas rather than Tamil areas, but also the death toll from the tsunami has never been factored into the sort of total death. Rather, the death toll from the tsunami and the death toll from civilians who died in the war. These things got extremely kind of entangled, and because of the tsunami, it enabled the government to also use the tsunami as a way not to record civilian deaths from the kind of conflict, because any deaths that appeared during the time of the environmental disaster then were attributed to the disaster rather than to any sort of acts of aggression on the part of the Sri Lankan state, for example. Let me see what else. Oh yes, sorry. My final case that I'll bring to your attention is towards the end of the book, and it's a bit of a kind of bookmark, in fact, to the beginning, the first case called Discovery. And it's called Failure to Appear, and it deals with the emergence of a new form of sensing called the gamma camera. And the gamma camera has the capacity to read radioactive contaminants in large open environments. So, and it was used specifically, a portable gamma camera was invented by Toshiba to visualize radioactive contamination from Fukushima Daiichi. So what we have at the end of the book, we return to a nuclear event, an event in which there's a case of nuclear evidence. Like Chernobyl, there's also a trial. The trial in Chernobyl was held behind closed doors within the exclusion zone itself. In Japan, the trial is still taking place, and unlike Chernobyl's trial, which was largely a trial in which low-level engineers and workers were scapegoated, in the case of TEPCO, the company that ran the power plant, the three senior executives, so CEO, chief financial officer, etc., have been charged and are have been directly charged and the trial continues. And so we do have a very different kind of legal outcome with respect to Fukushima Daiichi versus Chernobyl. But this case really looks at the kind of migration of radioactive contaminants that I talk about in the case Discovery, but also Hostile Witness. We start to see the ways in which the media object has become a kind of environmental system. So by the end of the book, an event of nuclear evidence is sensed, comes into perceptibility through the emergence of new technical systems, but also the meteorological substrate, if you will, is not a piece of film or a photograph or a video. It's an entire kind of environmental sort of system, and I'll show a little clip in short order about that. So that's and so Failure to Appear really looks at different modes of sensing, and also sensing, but also in relationship to different modes of knowing as well. And so that's just to signal, that was just to signal a number of the chapters in which there is a kind of ecological element. I'm now going to wrap up. And I have a whole, I hope this is going to, well, I think it'll give us a sense of the kind of texture of the book and the kinds of cases that I rally to make the argument around the operative nature of the material witness. So I'm just going to read the very, a couple of sort of excerpts right at the very end of the book. And we're going to return, so we're returning to this image here. I opened the book Material Witness with a description of a blurry image seared into the crystalline surface of a video monitor reclaimed from Prison Maze, Longkesh in Northern Ireland in 2000. The monitor had been turned off almost 20 years earlier, yet still carried an evidential trace of its carceral history in the form of a screen burn. I'm closing with another image, Medium, a disaster film created when hydrocarbon atoms were accidentally released from their pressurized containment to combine with salt water and sunlight. Both are technical systems whose structural composition responded to the intensification of external forces in uniquely mediatic ways. The registration of political and sectarian violence that was compressed into the phosphorus limit space of the screen is unfolded through this book until the media object becomes an extensive and multidimensional eco-aesthetic event whose violent abstractions are organized by the flows of finance capital and the molecular chaos of crude matter. This constitutes a progression from a discrete artifact to a networked assembly of relations, a transformation that also challenges notions of media that would locate their perceptual coherency and aesthetic repertoire entirely within the unified operations of specific human-centered events. As evidence for events migrates and assumes ever more materially dispersed and datafied arrangements, our critical investigative practices must take into account alternate modes of witnessing that operate across scales and entities, including the technical and the more than human. If that is, we are to challenge the powerful contexts and institutional formats that determine the particular relevance of events, or indeed to invent new ones. As cesium-137 becomes trace evidence, as documentary film becomes radioactive fossil, as microfiche becomes search engine, as machinic silence becomes political indictment, as photo reenactment becomes perjury, as 150 kilohertz becomes humanitarian crisis, as metadata becomes kill list, as atmospheric noise becomes accidental napalm, as Agent Orange becomes class action, as disturbed ground becomes war crime, as video alibi becomes arboreal witness, as anonymous footage becomes forensic proof, as contaminated forest becomes electromagnetic spectrum, as iron oxide becomes exiled memorial, as the sun becomes a liar, as extractive zone becomes toxic common, as grain becomes pixel, as electronic defect becomes testimony, as dust becomes impure matter, as poor image becomes dirty picture, As screen burn becomes oil spill, the material becomes a witness. So I'd like to conclude there.
Thank you, Susan. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
No, I said I'd like to conclude there. That's all.
Thank you, and I think it was really incredible to have that selection of images at the end, just to give the people who haven't seen the book a sense of the incredible case studies and materials that you're engaging with, and the kind of the links you're making between them. Are we going to have the break now, or?
Can I ask a question before everybody comes back? And I don't want to hog the time. So this was great. This was really rich, and it like provides a whole vocabulary, I think, and of what can be kind of brought into the arena of evidence. I really appreciate it. My question has to do with the side of evidence has been like really elaborated. And as I was listening to it, I thought the legal structure into which it's playing has not evolved to the same extent, that it feels imbalanced, that the sort of our understanding of what constitutes evidence, how it manifests in the world, how it, kind of becomes almost part of everyday life, really, really expanded and elaborated and so on. And the law feels as if it's left behind in a kind of really narrow and unequally developed way. So that's kind of fascinates me.
Mm-hmm.
It's not up to the task anymore.
No, it's not up to the task.
It's ask Susan questions about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, and that's the whole project of the book, is to, in some way, to demonstrate the ways in which the sort of the legal imagination and its strictures and protocols and the ways it polices what can happen within these highly kind of orchestrated domains. It discloses all of the things that don't sort of fit, in the same way that any metric, like the same way we could say within the university, the ways in which the metrics of ref disclose all of the practices and modes of working and that actually can't be captured by its very specific logic and imagination. And so the book is looking precisely at it's, it's engaging with these institutional formats in order to understand the ways in which they're determining kind of the relevance of things, so it's there, but it's always there in order to demonstrate the inadequacy, partiality, and so I completely agree. I think that's why, although this book has a kind of obviously strong kind of legal resonance, the work that I'm doing now, I'm thinking much more about material rights and what might be the creation and production of rights that aren't inscribed within a kind of legal imagination. And
yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Thanks for that. Because the precisely in the this idea that it's not the law that's expanded, but the understanding of evidence that is brought before the law is expanded. The sort of makes the law appear like a neoliberal mechanism, and the fact that it has so little capacity to respond to the needs from it. It kind of it gives one a very different understanding of the law, which is I find quite reassuring in a way, that it's not everything that it's kind of set up to be. Anyway, yeah, thank you. That's kind of really interesting. And the new work makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't want to take up time during, because there's so many students and former students and they want to ask questions. And I'll order the book, and then we can have another conversation. And listen, congratulations.
Thanks so much. Yeah. No, it's wonderful. And I mean, anyone who's interested, you can actually download, I think, pretty much the entire book from the Goldsmiths library as an ebook, or like big chunks of it. So it's very accessible. And the good thing, it's also actually quite affordable. I mean, I'm sure Shella, no, I appreciate that question. And I probably, I suspect it intersects with interests that Shella has and may want to pick up on, because the reason I mentioned the toxic tort case, because throughout the book I also start to look at the emergence of other forums in which there's such as, let's say, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, the emergence of the People Tribunal. What are other forums that have developed in part as a response to the inadequacies or limitations of legal kind of systems? So that's a really important dimension. So things that are operating in excess of legal kind of principles and ways of structuring arguments, in fact.
Yeah, and there's almost a possibility. I mean, we'll leave that for a one-to-one conversation, but there's almost a possibility to then detach it from the law and begin to elaborate it as something that isn't limited by the facing to the law, that is about, you know, the sort of maybe another register of what it is to speak truth. Or to not to speak truth, to discern truth in one's immediate surroundings. So it can get, not just exceed the site of the trial, but it can exceed a relation to the law. You know, the become more than.
Yeah. So the one thing I would say is, having spent like years with the materials from the ICTY, I think we also we tend to think of these legal spaces as these, you know, like these kind of like machinic operations, that there's something operating that is very like a well-oiled machine, in fact. But of course, it's not the case at all. And people enter into those spaces with all kinds of different subjectivities, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I won't go on about it at great length, but as a kind of visual artist and practitioners, I mean, I was very interested initially just to see how is it that films, videos, photographs, sound, like how are they actually being dealt with? How are they being understood in these spaces? What's at stake, you know? And I realized there's a completely other set of kind of questions that are being asked, and I found it incredibly also fascinating as an outsider to understand the role that, say, these audiovisual materials were playing within these cases. And there was a complete kind of reframing, and that was also really kind of insightful for me. And that's where I kind of began there, and I'm still really interested in questions of jurisprudence, but but rather how might we think about a kind of a jurisprudence that could be future oriented rather than a retrospective based on precedents and what has transpired in the kind of past. How we might reformulate questions of rights, justice, etc., that are future oriented. So in some way. And I think there's many critical legal scholars who are engaged with these kinds of questions. Yeah.
I think it's the excess that I'm thinking of is in relation to the legal, it becomes a sort of a form of calculation, sort of going beyond the legal it begins to be testimony to the kind of interrelations of a lot of economies and impacts on the surroundings. And that kind of allows it to be more. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to switch everything off so that I'm not hogging airtime.
I wonder though, I mean, maybe we keep people with their cameras on because it's actually quite nice to see people as long as everyone's muted.
But maybe each person, as they ask a question, can...
Yeah, but also just to have I mean, for me, I don't know about you, Susan, but it's nice to see a sea of faces when we're talking, right? As long as everyone's mute.
Yeah, no, I enjoy seeing, and there I see Enrico, one of our, he is in fact a lawyer. He had for MA environmental.
It's much nicer this way. It's like we're in a classroom. Yeah. Irit, you've kind of just raised all the things I was going to raise, so that's good. I know maybe I'm asking the right. No, because it's great. It's great.
No, but I did it privately without an audience, so you can raise them all again.
No, I think no. I'm going to raise them otherwise. And hang on, it's already 6:33, so I'll try not to take too long. Just to sort of open up questions and continue what you were saying, Irit. And Susan, I thought, I mean, as you already said at the beginning, first of all, thank you for the presentation. That I'm also interested in these questions of more than human witnessing, but from a specifically post and decolonial perspective. And so there's so many questions that your work raises around issues of representation and voice and silencing, different forms of, be it aesthetic or political sort of proxy representation. So I wanted to push you a bit, and I think you've seen this coming, on the decolonial. And I mean, it's a term that doesn't appear in the book, as far as I know, likewise for the post-colonial. But my reading of the book is that it is, without saying as much, it is inherently useful for decolonial work. In many ways, just as we've had this conversation that actually, you know, the book is inflected through feminist practices and writing without saying as much. And so I want to sort of tease out the question of the use of the book in its propositional format, which is what you've already mentioned, for decolonial questions. And I was just struck by, there was a quote that was flying around on social media this morning by the historian and development studies scholar Sabelo Ndlovu-Gadsheni, talking about, and I'm not expecting you to respond about the US elections, but saying the core problem of the US is of being a successful white colony. Democratization always fails to take root in a settler colony because of entrenched white supremacy, and just sort of selecting parts. This is why voting for Barack Obama did not change much. He sat on a white structure of power. And thus a win by Biden in a successful settler colony might mitigate Trumpian lunacy and clownish politics, but it won't change the course and character of a settler colony. And, you know, there have been heartening bits of news in terms of various Congress men and women who've been elected. And there's been a record number of Native American women elected to Congress. Which is on the one hand a celebration, but on the other hand, it's not going to change that structure of white supremacy. And I think, you know, in many of your projects, your artworks, you're engaging with the settler colonial context, in particular the Canadian one. And I know you've spoken about this before, about this sort of desire to engage with that structure of coloniality in the place that you lived and worked for a very long time. And so I think that question of sort of election of certain people opens up questions about representation, as I already mentioned, as an aesthetic act and as a political proxy act. And this is something that your work, Nature Represents Itself, which you showed some images of at the end, really does sort of bring up, and we can maybe come back to that work and talk about that. But so, yeah, as I mentioned, to me, there is a decolonial aspect to the work. And I also wanted to raise the big question of your relationship to law. And, you know, Irita already phrased this in terms of the way in which like this expansion of what counts as evidence hasn't been matched by the expansion of the law, and your work really shows that. And throughout the book, you're talking about the sort of limitations of the law and the limitations of these scenes of producing evidence, or what counts as legitimate or valid evidence. But what wasn't mentioned yet is the inherently colonial aspect of law, or sort of law as Western. And so this big question that we've spoken about a little bit before, about to what degree can one move beyond this sort of the sort of residues of colonialism or coloniality within Western law. What can the law, and we can't, to what degree can we say the law anyway in the first place? But what can a sort of colonial Western law, what can it register, what can it accept, what can it hear? You've spoken about, sort of sensing practices and what judges can and can't hear. What can it translate? Or the big question would be, well, what needs to be done to the law? Whereas other activists and artists, I'm thinking of the Karabing collective in the Northern Territories in Australia, would just say, we're going to keep away from that Western law. And that has, in a sense, there's nothing that can be done to that framework of law that can help us. So I want to sort of ask you a little bit about how you position the material witness within this. And throughout the book, because that's a huge question to answer. So so I want to make it, that's my big interest, and I want to sort of specify a little bit. And you talk in particular when you're writing about the work, Can the Sun Lie? And Inuit knowledge of the local ecology, in particular the sun, the horizon, and the placement of the sun. And you talk about how at COP21, this knowledge, these claims were sort of not ridiculed, but they weren't accepted. And you talk about how oftentimes, indigenous knowledge is usually seen as a form of myth or story, for instance, that doesn't count as a valid form of knowledge, vis-a-vis scientific, empirical knowledge. And the sort of sense that myths and stories are the sense-making operations of indigenous knowledge. Of course, many people have contested this. And so there's this idea of the incommensurable that's within your work, and it's something that you talk about specifically in relation to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and sort of more the Western legacies of truth commissions as opposed to Truth and Reconciliation commissions that are premised more upon the incommensurable rather than the sort of calculable sense of law as programmatic. So that's one way I'd like to sort of think about what role does the material witness play within, on the one hand, the incommensurable, and on the other hand, the programmatic or the computable or computational. So that's also a big question, but I think also this question of the sort of propositional nature that you were talking about earlier with Irit, and how, you mentioned Derrida's work on testimony as sort of being, you bear witness to something that had happened in the past, whereas actually we're seeing in your work on the material witness, there is a kind of a witnessing of what counts as testimony in the present moment. And also when it comes to climate change, it's also what's being borne witness to in the future, because we see these sort of registrations, especially in the environment. And when you talk about earth evidence, we see these registrations of potential future harm. And I wanted to push you a bit more on the notion of the proxy, because you talk about your practice, your aesthetic practice or aesthetic projects, as proxies, which I think it's a really useful way to sort of work through many of the issues that you're talking about and the different scales. So you cite the historian Gabriel Hecht, who talks about the African Anthropocene and talks about nuclearity, and her idea of the sort of interscalar vehicles. So for instance, it could be a piece of uranium, or, you know, there could be a material object that operates as an interscalar vehicle that allows you to make connections between, you know, rather than moving one way from the local to the planetary, you're making connections between different scales. And you cite the work of Harun Farocki and his act of sort of burning a cigarette on his arm in order to try and somehow make understandable the effects of the napalm in the Russell Tribunal. And so you talk about your projects as proxies, as using proxies, using the material witness as a proxy that functions in this kind of interscalar way. And you talk about these proxies as being propositional. I mean, I have loads of quotes, but for the sake of time, I was just sort of summarizing. But you do talk about them as being propositional and potentially proposing alternative forms of assemblies or alternative forms of registration, sensing, intelligibility, so on and so forth. So this is a very long-winded way of coming back to Irit's question, like, how do you position yourself within the constraints of the law, the Western law, and what role does the material witness play in thinking about alternative forms of truth-making and claims and rights claims that might move beyond the Western frameworks of law?
Okay, I will try and respond if
just parts of it. It's okay.
No, I'll do my best to sort of pick up certain things, because hopefully they'll be useful for the sort of broader discussion we're hoping to have. And firstly, there's many things that I'd like to say. I mean, one of the things that I don't think is perhaps isn't sufficiently developed in the book, and in some way what I didn't want to do was have the project of the material witness be kind of in dialogue with something that is called new materialism. It's not really a book that is about a kind of discussion with that sort of body of kind of work. And in part, what I was always trying to do was not to invoke a kind of generalized sense of matter, because I think that is where it's extremely kind of problematic, the kind of enchantment, if you will, with matter that we hear actually quite a bit certainly within the humanities, that isn't kind of specific enough to the kind of situated context in which that is being discussed. This to me, this is absolutely kind of crucial, like these kind of general invocations of kind of material sensibility. And, you know, I think Arthur Jafa said it really well in this interview, where he's going to say, he was saying something to the effect that it's kind of hard to get fully on board with the kind of interest in matter, material, when your own subjectivity has never fully attained the kind of the category of the subject, if you will, has always been overly identified with property, object, matter, etc. And so the kind of that whole, and I think that's a crucial kind of point, and of course something many people are dealing with. But so my strategy throughout the book was always to locate it within very particular cases, situations, and sort of this, in some way, a kind of technical kind of specificity is kind of crucial. Otherwise, I think the pitfalls are enormous when we're invoking sort of anything in kind of general kind of terms. The proxy is an interesting concept for me. Like the notion of proxy data really comes out of climate science. And so for those who are listening online, so scientists will refer to something like tree rings as proxy data. A tree ring is a mode of measurement that allows us to have some sense of temperature and precipitation prior to the invention of things like thermometers. So the world is full of all kinds of forms of proxy data. ocean sediments are a great, they go back millions of years. The stalagmites in caves, because stalagmites form when there's precipitation or water moisture. So that's another form of proxy data that climate scientists use. There's all kinds. I've been working on ice cores, which are considered the so-called highest resolution form of proxy data, because ice carries air bubbles from anything in the atmosphere ends up in the ice core record, and you have the thing itself. So it's not actually a proxy. We have the thing itself. But interestingly enough, and this is really a consequence of the sort of collaborations I've done with climate scientists, has been the degree to which scientists, if they want to understand aspects of the world, let's say before the invention of certain kinds of tools, measurements, and probes, or just to expand the repertoire of like so-called, if we want to call it evidence, have looked at cultural materials. They do look at things like farmers' almanacs to understand what the temperature might have been, shipping logs, things like that, literary works, etc., paintings, art historical paintings, and something I've dealt with in another kind of project, the sort of enormous output of Jacob van Liestal, who's a Dutch landscape painter, whose work in the Netherlands, climate scientists and atmospheric scientists are looking at that form of proxy data. They're looking at the art historical record because it's one of the few things they have where there's an attempt to visualize the atmosphere. So there's a lot of things that can furnish a form of proxy data. And I kind of like to think in some way, maybe is it the material witness, or is it my own sort of kind of, let's say, projects that are often perhaps might fall into that category because they're somehow trying to offer up information that is pertinent to different sort of questions, if you will, but it's not through some sort of like necessarily kind of empirical kind of trajectory. So I think the proxy is quite potentially kind of useful because precisely because it opens up some of these techno-scientific and legal questions to culture and to aesthetics. And it actually, so that I think that's been very helpful for me. I guess maybe a final point I'll make, Shella, would be I have been very interested in the ways in which, and I sort of already was saying this to Reed, the kind of like, I do feel that one needs to understand the logic that is operating, that is structuring decision-making, policies, etc. I mean, I've always had a keen interest in actually understanding how a given system kind of works. And so in that sense, I do find myself entering into these kinds of systems and trying to grapple with all of, for example, when it comes to ice core, I'm talking about stuff that's not really even in the book right now, but it's more on my mind, shall we say. But
well, it's evoked. It's mentioned a bit in the book.
Yeah, it's mentioned, but it's just a kind of useful example because we have a piece of ice that's extracted from an ice sheet in the Arctic, in Greenland or Antarctica. But so we have this sort of volumetric kind of form that's pulled out of the earth, and it's saturated with information, but in that sort of so-called natural material within short order is a data set. It enters into public policy. It becomes a techno-scientific object of inquiry. It becomes a part of discourse. Like very quickly, if you actually look at something like an ice core, you see the kind of incredible kind of speed at which this material object is translated across sometimes almost incommensurate domains, So that is really interesting, I think, and is to actually follow these materials as they move through different domains, each of which produces their own forms of intelligibility. And then you start to see what's significant, what's being looked at, what is perceived to be relevant, what's not, what's falling out. And so these material objects move across some epistemic frameworks, different disciplinary kind of apparatuses. And so for me, that is the interest is not, the interest or the work of the book isn't really, oh, I want to create a different, something, a counter institution, but it's rather to understand the protocols, practices, procedures in which, because I don't think the possibility of imagining a different kind of law, or a different, law probably isn't the right word. What would be a different form of accountability, a different conception of rights? I still have to actually understand the kind of existing ways in which these very powerful structures are operating, even to start to kind of think about what might be kind of possible. So my project has never been in some way like an artist like Jonas Stahl or a thinker. I'm going to produce a parallel parliament and utilize the strictures of the art world to sort of bypass certain kind of, let's say, regulatory frames that are working within the domain of sort of immigration politics or border security or something like that. It's not about, I mean, for me, it's always been about trying to understand the sort of, as I said, whether it's the legal imagination, the scientific kind of imagination, the ways in which all of these domains of knowledge practice set up their subjects, what kinds of questions they ask. To me, it's like knowledge practices and how to be producing knowledge, and knowledge what counts as knowledge, what counts as relevance, but also what are the questions that we might share. So maybe that's a bit of a ramble, but I think that's sort of, for the moment, the simplest way to answer your kind of bundle of questions.
Yes, sorry. But no, you actually did respond to the main points, because I just found a quote here where you're talking about, and it's interesting because you talk about the aesthetic projects rather than like materials that you were investigating specifically, or you don't say like the artwork, you say the aesthetic projects function as investigative project proxies, forging new categories of assembly across disparate events and domains of practice that also serve to generate many of the insights that I bring to this writing. So, and I think maybe because Irit was saying, what is it to speak truth? But that's also a question of like, what is it to ask for rights or to make claims for rights? And I know you have some thoughts on like different conceptions of rights as they pertain to materiality or various forms of matter. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Actually, something I realized I should say, which is in relationship to the propositional. So I also need to stress that this isn't like, I'm not arguing for an anything goes kind of, let's just have an alternate fact, right? This is not about producing alternate facts, right? But it's and that's, maybe it's a sort of fine distinction, like when we talk about kind of propositional thinking as a way to expand, that's why I really appreciate Haraway's notion of distributing the narrative field so that all versions of events are operating in friction or in tension with each other. It's not to say my facts are better than your facts, or more kind of like, or my belief system is, more is the right belief system. So it's about all of the different ways in which these are operating in relationship to each other. And I mean, so I think I just wanted to make that kind of point, because I often think back to this older article of Bruno Latour. I do think back to this article that he wrote quite some time ago, where he was confronting the fact that that he'd spent his whole life, talking about the social construction of facts, but in the face of climate change, wanted to say, no, some things just aren't facts. Facts, they're not socially kind of constructed. He found himself a bit kind of backed into a corner.
Sure.
Right? So when I'm talking about the forensic imagination or the kind of propositional mode, it's not in relationship to saying, It's not to simply say that it's all up for grabs.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I think I just wanted to make
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And I think, I mean, that really plays out in a film like Can the Sun Lie? Which I know Lynn has a question about, but also maybe just to add in terms of clarifying with terminology, maybe, I mean, I wasn't proposing by any means you step outside entirely of the law. I was just trying to understand how the material witness functions as a proxy or as something that allows us to move through the sort of constrictions and different iterations of the law. But maybe the idea of the justice and, you know, you mentioned accountability, so how a different form, because you speak of a conception of justice that could assume a more projective and holistic character than those produced by traditional judicial mechanisms. So maybe that's another way of thinking about it. And you talk about a kind of ethics of the incommensurable as well. But maybe I should hand over to Lynn. Do you want to actually speak your question out loud? Or actually you have to, because you just said you have a question about the lying sun.
Oh, sure. I'm just plugging myself in so the whole thing doesn't suddenly die. All right. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Lynn, nice to see you.
I also just wanted to say to you, I remember one of our conversations in the before times when you were a little uncharacteristically reticent about the book, in distinction to your gallery kind of art practice, and it was just so lovely to hear you kind of inhabit the book and the readings, especially at the end. And it was also really good, and I think really good for the students that are in the audience to hear you insist on the reading of it aloud. And how that actually really mattered to your own, poetic sense making, materials that might not immediately announce themselves as poetic, right, in a more banal sense. Maybe that's just a comment, but I'm always interested in the subject of the lie, and I think it's one of those other fantasy topics. If I had but world enough and time, I would be interested in thinking about, what is it to lie substantially? So I wondered about, maybe you could say a little bit more about Can the Sun Lie? And of course, I'm tapping into different archives of thought than your own. I mean, I'm, not least because, and of course I have to say this, not least because, Derrida has written at length about, the kind of problem of the sun in metaphysics as a kind of transcendental signifier. And he's also written in his later writings very critically around the ways in which the lie can be construed as the proper of the human, precise. So my cat is now knocking over my delicate little structure with the computer. But yeah, so really identifying the question of the lie as a problematic and actually kind of ironic proof of human, that only the human can lie. So I was just kind of interested to hear a bit more about the Sun project, the lying sun.
Yeah, well, it's more of an artwork than I do address it in the sort of final sections of the book. That specific kind of case, the phrase "Can the sun lie?" was asked by a judge in the 19th century in a court case where a photograph was entered as evidence for the first time. And I think, so today we'd go, well, that's not a big deal, but we have to understand a photograph is a representation of an event, or it's not the thing itself, right? And so now we're very used to seeing videos and photographs of whatever events that have happened, and those documentary materials end up in courts of law, and then they can be subject to kind of dispute and debate. And of course, they were in the 19th century, but the judge was asking an even more complex kind of question, because he was asking whether, when he said, "Can the sun lie?" what he was actually asking was, Could the could the role of chemistry in the photographic practice, could sunlight, which we're thinking about analog photography here, could the role of light in combination with chemistry and paper, could that actually furnish a deceit? Could that actually produce a false reality? And then he was asking whether, so could sunlight be a kind of collusive agent in the production of a kind of false truth, or was the photograph actually a more resolute and impartial witness in a human being who might have a subjective recollection of events, right? And he's the judge in this 19th century court case is actually sort of musing these questions sort of out loud. What's the role, like who might be the most kind of convincing kind of witness? I just found that an extremely kind of provocative question, but at the time I was also trying to then kind of fast forward that question to a situation that was happening in Canada at the time. I'm still living in Canada, and Zacharias Kunuk had just released a documentary called Inuit Knowledge and kind of Climate Change. And part of the kind of public conversations that were happening in relationship to his work, he is an Inuit filmmaker, but the communities he had also been interviewing, whereas this kind of repeated assertion on the part of many different Inuit communities and elders that the sun was migrating 16 kilometers further west, so that the sun was out of alignment, and the stars, in fact, are also out of alignment. Like, if we think about changing life worlds in the Arctic regions of the world, the kind of accelerated impacts of global warming are throwing that, the cryospheric kind of matter, if you will, is radically being warped and changed by global warming. So all of the systems, all of the topological registration systems, whereby, say, in the case of the Canadian context, where, say, Inuit communities might have actually used it as place markers and way markers for travel, etc. All of that is kind of changing. But nonetheless, to make a long story short, this kind of observation that the sun had actually shifted was then happening at the same time that there was an Inuit delegation going to COPE in Copenhagen. And there was a kind of real kind of suppression on part of the scientific community that none of these kinds of observations should be publicly articulated, that that Inuit people or indigenous people would lose all credibility as subjects able to speak on behalf of their embodied kind of lived experience and observations. So there's this contestation emerged around the sun in this, and but what ultimately transpired was that I can't pronounce that word, so let's this tropospheric warming and thermal inversions, that there is in fact a changing optical regime happening in the north, which is a consequence of warming. That the ice sheets that are, and we have things like albedo, which is the reflective property of snow that bounces light back up into the atmosphere. So albedo effects, but also the moisture content in the air and the crystalline structure and ice of snow, which is it's a lens-based system. That's what snow is. It's billions and billions of crystals, and it's bouncing light around. And all of the impacts of accelerated climate change are actually modifying the ice sheets, and it's actually changing the ways in which light behaves. And so what Inuit communities were observing and documenting wasn't some sort of hallucinogenic aberration, but in fact what was actually kind of happening. But the consequence was that there was kind of this disbelief, and then eventually some scientists from I think the University of Manitoba that work on polar optics went and sure enough corroborated that this is in fact what's happening. So this whole case, which I don't go into great length, it's just mentioned in the end, but is like you start to really see all of the relationships that the whole book is also trying to kind of unpack or kind of trouble, right? Who is the expert? Who gets to speak on behalf of their experience, their observations? Who's listened to, who's kind of dismissed. But we also see global warming as changing an aesthetic regime, which I think was also kind of interesting. It's not just changing environmental systems; it's changing the way that we can see what we can see, how much light enters into the cornea and cones of our eyes, etc. So. I think I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, that's my dog. But so that's just that question of deceit, to me, that was asked in the 19th century, came hurtling back to me at this moment when it reemerges. And then that was, of course, all with the background of kind of climate denial, right? And the idea that the material world was, there was a kind of like, what are the sort of lies that are happening in relationship to climate change, right? Who's the liar, It's clearly not the Inuit communities. They may not have had the exact scientific kind of understanding to like speak or to like as if I would have that myself, we wouldn't have it either, right? To understand the kind of very particular scientific process that's happening there. But, the relationship of lying in relationship to the aesthetic kind of like agency of sunlight sort of was kind of renewed in a very different way with this case. And I guess maybe the final thing I'd say in relationship to the lie, I mean, I've always found Hannah Arendt's text that she wrote, Lying in Politics, interesting in that because she begins the text with this provocation that politics requires, there's like that lying in some way, or she looks at the relationship between imagination and the lie and lying in politics. And she's saying that lie always requires a certain kind of imaginative leap. And the force of the lie is also its capacity to imagine a different reality, right? Whatever that reality might be. And so she's talking about the kind of force of imagination as a kind of political, like we're conjuring a different world. That she goes, that's the kind of like, that's imagination operating in the role of politics, is to imagine a different world than the one you inhabit. That's why, imagination is always, or politics is always bound up with imagination. But the lie is also then part of this kind of dynamic. So it's an interesting kind of text and it'd be worth kind of revisiting. I haven't done that for a long time, but I don't know. I don't even know how I'd situate that within our contemporary kind of political kind of climate. Leave that to everybody in the audience.
It'd be interesting in terms of this idea of agnotology, like the sort of production of ignorance as well. There's a question from Anna Engelhardt. Anna's is the only question so far. Can you elaborate on your criticism in relation to new materialism? And then she's given a quote from the book. Can you see that in the chat?
Yeah, I'm just reading it now. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Do you want to read out the quote?
Yeah. What's interesting about this experience, when you write a book, it's a multi-year endeavor. And so, I haven't actually read it lately.
Do you want to read out that quotation? It might be useful.
Sure. I think the quotation is, the term matter is used throughout to refer to non-human entities, whether they are material or dematerialized in nature. But this is not the inhuman matter of chattel slavery, the legacy of which endures and deeply troubles certain investments in new materialist thought, organized by simple ontological lures without any attendant politics. In my analysis, matters a question of properties, the capacity of materials to register change, resulting in an accrual of information, and not an issue of property out of which surplus value might be extracted. So, yeah, it's kind of linking back also to the question that you asked at the beginning. So yeah, a lot of the book is looking at what are the material properties, which is also the ways in which I don't know if I should get into that now, to be honest, but I really appreciate the work of Patricia Tintoretto-Clow, who looks at the ways in which new conceptions of materiality emerge, because the ability to measure, calculate within the sort of life science has produced a new conception of what counts as material. So she was arguing, I think the notion of material that we might tend to hang on to, which is like this stuff here that I'm holding in my hand, even that has a very specific kind of, like, matter has very particular kinds of understandings when you move into different sort of disciplines again. But yeah, I'm always interested in what are the kind of properties that materials have. So when I'm working on the case of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm looking at the specific properties of that particular kind of crude oil, what that has, and why that then enables this particular, why that, yeah. So in order to then make that sort of argument about the oil slick as an oil film that is kind of representing itself. But once again, I had to look at the kind of specific properties of that matter to understand its sort of molecular makeup, and then how it actually, how it refracts sunlight, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if there's an actual question there, or it was just, maybe I missed the beginning. Can you elaborate on criticism in relation? I don't have much more to say about new materialism, except that the only thing I might add, and this is, maybe it's not entirely fair, but sometimes I feel that the kinds of things that are the cases that people are looking at, perhaps sometimes seem a bit arbitrary to me. Maybe that would be my only kind of criticism. Like, the material world is, for everybody, is a space of potential kind of enchantment, but I always wanted to look at very particular kinds of materials. It's not the fact that as I said at the very beginning of the talk, for me the material witness it's the event of evidence, but it's also evidence of events. And so so I don't really go into the realm of new materialism, because that's not where my stakes are. It's much more to say that all matter registers evidence of event. My hand on this table right now during this talk, and I realize we're over time, the oils on my hand are registering on the surface of this table, and if a crime was happened in my lounge, then that might be important information that somebody could sort of forensically access, but in general it's not important. So this is a crucial kind of distinction, is I have to also look at the ways in which that specific evidence matters in a very particular situation. And at that point, then we can start to understand why something is relevant and worthy of paying attention to or not. So I needed the two parts to the material witness: registering information, registering events, but also giving us insight into the event of evidence making. Yeah. And that's where I'm positioned. So I'm not in the sort of just looking at this sort of matter from a new materialist perspective. Yeah.
We're over time, but maybe if there's one pressing question left. And people are slowly leaving, so anyone who's tired or has to leave,
Yeah, I'm sure.
is already going. But anything urgent, nobody's put anything in the chat.
I guess the great thing about the
there's-
online talk, no one slams the door like they do in the Professor Stewart Hall.
that's true. There's a, oh, Doreen, we've been having this conversation, Susan and I, a couple of times recently. I'm just reading diagonally, I think, let me just check. Okay, to read out for people, situating the material witness in relation to decolonizing practices and the coloniality of the law makes you wonder, could the material witness also be read in relation to the idea of residence time that Christina Sharp talks about in The Wake, the molecular traces of the human body in the water of the Atlantic as an evidence of the genocidal crimes of slavery and the transatlantic trade. So can you say, Susan, something about the politics of time as trans-historical time in the field of the political in the material witness? Mm-hmm. Nice question.
Yeah, it's a beautifully written question. And hi, Doreen. It's lovely to see you online here.
Please do put your camera on, anyone who wants to join the conversation.
My camera does not work.
Oh, okay. All right.
Sorry, but it's lovely to see you, and it's amazing to follow. Thank you.
Well, no, so glad you could make it. Yes, we've had many conversations, of course, about, and in fact, the material witness. At a certain point, I stalled, and I had a real kind of like late night sort of talk with Kojo and Doreen. They're really kind of like pushing the project along and insisting that it had to go forward. So it was an important moment to have that conversation, Doreen. But I do agree. I think why the notion of residence time in Christina Sharp's work, it definitely resonates with resonates with me precisely because to me that's a moment where there's a kind of like, it's not simply a kind of poetics of matter, but it's actually understanding that this is the very specific process whereby, say, a whale that might die in the ocean, the body doesn't simply drift to the very kind of bottom of the seabed floor, but is actually held in these different sort of, like, I guess the different the different properties of water, densities, currents, the water column, suspends bodies in the oceanic space, because it's actually a quite stratified space, and that the corpse of a whale would then be the host for other forms, other kind of like sea life, et cetera, et cetera. So this concept of resonance time, I think it was really kind of powerful for me because it's, as I said, it's not simply a kind of poetics that says every water molecule. It allows us to understand what might actually happen to a body that is thrown into the sea or disposed into the ocean, within the context of the transatlantic slave trade, in the middle kind of passage of this. I think there's something about the specificity of the concept that is crucial, right? And we start to imagine, and then of course, that body that is also held in suspension between perhaps different layers of oceanic kind of life and becomes an island for other kinds of worlds, if you will, becomes really kind of powerful also with, in so many ways for writing, for musicians, etc. So you have a very particular kind of, in fact, technical kind of process, and understanding that technical process, I think, opens up a real kind of imaginative register. And to me, it's the specificity of the concept that I think is sort of kind of crucial, which I realize doesn't answer the question of time, but it's a key moment in her work for me that I feel very strongly attached to, because it's not ambient, it's not a kind of the poeticization of just matter, which sometimes happens well, it happens all the time, in fact. And it's like, so it's the thing, when you understand, say, the very sort of specific technical systems that might be operating, it's possible that they can open up really interesting pathways that would be lost if one is sort of working in a more kind of perhaps in a more kind of sort of generalized sort of mode, I guess. And then I suppose, yeah, I realize we've gone on a great length, but the question of time, for me, the material witness then is also, I think, Shella mentioned the sort of interscalar, but I also see those materials and the sort of return to those materials. And I think that might be, well, trying to say this in a quickest way as I can, really, but
I have a quote
of
your writing. Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to hear that. I guess what I was going to say was, sometimes in the book I'm actually dealing with things that are very familiar, like the image of Kim Phuc, who was the little girl who survives the napalm bombing. But I went back into that case because the one thing that has never been talked about is the fact that that image that ends up on the cover of the New York Times in 1972 was transmitted as an audio signal, because that's the way in which the picture technology at the time at the time of Vietnam, in the time of the 60s and 70s, that's how all wire images were moving. So with the image that we actually have, and the image that, say, art history or photocriticism writes about, is a very different image. It looks completely different than the image that actually was sent, which was much more super grainy, et cetera, much more what we'd say today low res. But also in doing kind of research around that particular technology, and actually I was looking at the weather on the day that was sent in Saigon, from the Saigon Post and Telegraph Office, and if there's any inclement weather, if there's any sort of rain or any meteorological conditions, that also feeds information into the radio kind of signal. So understanding how that image actually was transmitted and moved through the atmosphere from Saigon to Tokyo to New York, the ways in which it accrued information along the way, enabled me to kind of open up that image in an entirely different way. So it's sort of like, yeah, in some way I used it to time travel to a very different kind of place, even though it's in some way very familiar historical kind of artifact. But I think it's only because I actually sort of investigated, like, how did this image actually make it here? You know, what were the processes that needed to happen for that image to end up in the kind of world, and going down the kind of technical route suddenly completely transformed the ways in which I understood its sort of emergence, if you will. So I think the material witness sometimes enables this sort of a mode of kind of time traveling, also to return to things and to then bring them back to the present, but kind of differently. And then, of course, the image then became part of a kind of an issue with Facebook and was banned on Facebook's platform because of their laws around, but through content moderation, etc. So then I also was then able to open up the sort of more contemporary story of social media and practices of content moderation and the labor practices around content moderation, which are outsourced to, countries, very, very poor workers in places like the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the ways in which the sort of time operated, I guess, in these sort of case studies, is just forge connections, sometimes between seemingly, I guess, in Shella's words, sometimes seemingly incommensurate kind of domains. So maybe that's the best way to answer that. But I'd love to hear your quote, Shella, if you want to read that.
You might not have read it for a while. So you're saying that in this research project, the interscalar is a property of the material witness. that enables transversal connections to be made, retroactively potentializing them and prospectively activating them. And then I cut off. So anyway, but that was in terms of the temporality. But I also, I mean, probably, Doreen, there's a lot more to be said in terms of like resonance and mourning and memorialization as well. And certainly, like Susan, in your work about the kind of the memorial and exile for the Amaska mine. And I think there are questions that one could read really interesting issues of memorialization and mourning and memory work through your work, even though the book isn't actually presented as that. So I think it's a really nice question of yours, Doreen. Yeah. We probably should wrap up. I mean, there's still like 65 or so, 72 of us with us. But maybe you're exhausted, Susan. So...
I mean, I'm fine, and I have to say, it's a real treat to have people, I mean, readers dip into the book, pull out things, but also, I mean, the conversations are also really valuable because, and this I think will really, and the students will figure this out in their own dissertation projects as well. It's like, at a certain point, you have to bracket things off, and your research, the things that you're doing are constantly kind of moving. And when you're doing any sort of project, it has its kind of time scale. It has you're managing the scale and scope of that. And then you some point you have to cut that. And it's the hardest thing to do because then it might go out to reviewers or it's in an editorial process and you have this desire to tinker with it and add things because you're now in my case, I was doing different, by the time it came out, I mean, by the time I was editing it, I was working on a whole new kind of research project. And there was a part of me that thought, oh, I need to go back to the beginning and sort of reformulate and recalibrate because my thinking and my insights and reflections had changed. So it's also kind of, I think, accepting a project at a certain state as a kind of, kind of like be willing to accept it as a kind of as a work in progress, I guess, and to not think of it as it, I don't know if that makes sense, but I found that kind of challenging, but also had to sort of come to like, be, I guess, okay with sort of in its whatever state it sort of goes out into the world, knowing that it would be a different book if I, got back into sort of editing and rewriting the parts that I'd sort of love to do. And it's just how we actually, allowing something to be, I guess, a kind of archive of a certain kind of moment in one's sort of life, and then a necessity for not going back, but actually using these conversations and other people's engagements with it to see whether, where these ideas can go. So I really appreciate having this chance tonight to do that. And so thank you to everybody for their incredible patience and insights. And feel free, if you do actually end up having a copy of the book in your hand, whether it's from the library or something you own, and feel like sending me an image to my material witness sightings.
Shall we? Uli's had enough. Shall we? Oh.
Yes.
Maybe people want to put their camera on to join me in thanking Susan for the presentation. And thank you, Yorella and Wood, for organizing this. You can even put your mics on and make some sound.
Fabulous, thank you.
See everyone.
You forget what the point of it all is, don't you? So it's a joy. Thank you for such a wonderful. Thank you, Shella. Thank you, Wood. Brilliant. And we'll have the recordings. We need to kind of tidy them up, but these will all be available at some point. We'll let you know.
Great. For everybody, wonderful to see you all online. And I just saw a scene quickly Bridget, Nicole, Katerina, Lynn. So nice. Yeah. Thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. And I guess time to sign off.
Yeah.
Who's
Chat.
I
leaving?
need to remember to save the recording before I. I'm going to do it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop it now if that's okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
Oh, there's lots of nice comments for you, Susan.